Well, here with us now is the former Director General of the UK Border Force, Tony Smith. He's now a global border security consultant. Welcome to you indeed. First of all, your reaction to what's gone on today?
Very difficult situation. I worked in the Border Force for many, many years. I haven't seen this kind of pressure for a long, long time on the port of Calais. I mean, I think people need to realise that the Border Force will still be there. Everybody still will be checked. There will be a contingency plan in place to ensure that those searches take place. But of course, the big dynamic now is, as your report shows, a very large number of people that are in Calais in the surrounding area. So obviously, when there's a backup like this, when service is disrupted, then it seems as though they can sort of relatively, with impunity, board vessels and vehicles entering the port.
I mean, we know in the past some of the camps have been dismantled. But really, is there anything the French authorities can do?
Well, the difficulty is returns, really. So, you know, the French, first of all, don't have the same strategic advantages we have over their borders. They don't control the southern borders. So vast numbers of people can drift into France. Some claim asylum, some won't. They go into a process, but even at the end of that process, it's extremely difficult to return people. So they're left in this kind of limbo situation where they haven't really got a clear status in France. They don't necessarily want to stay in France, even if they do qualify for protection. And consequently, you know, there's this push towards the northern French coast to try and get into the UK.
And when you've spoken to your opposite numbers in France or French authorities, what do they say about the problem?
Well, I mean, there is some good close cooperation going on the things like, you know, the smuggling rings and the intelligence-led controls and that kind of stuff. So there's really good working relationships, both in Calais and at national level. But I mean, the problem, of course, you know, as we've discussed this before, is this huge migration into the EU. And you know, the numbers now are astonishing, the numbers getting into the EU in the first place. And then because there are no borders in Europe, then people can just sort of roam around.
Now, we understand 39,000 people were stopped last year trying to get into the UK on one side of the channel or the other. How many do you think are getting through? Is there any way of estimating?
Well, I mean, the only way we would know that is if they bring themselves to our attention. And those that do bring themselves to our attention would normally claim asylum. And so the best yardstick we've got, I suppose, is the asylum figures. And that's been fairly static here, about 30,000 a year for the last 10 years. But I can remember a time when I worked in the department when we had 90,000 in a year. And that was before we moved to Calais. And so, you know, there's a significant, if you look at the French, they get 65,000, the Italians 65,000, the Germans 200,000. Actually, our asylum intake figures have remained fairly constant. I think that's because we have maintained our internal frontier.
What do you mean when you say we moved to Calais?
Well, it's a juxtaposed controls arrangement established under the Treaty of Sanguet, where we have an agreement where essentially, you know, the British border force can operate in Calais. And similarly, you know, the French will operate in Dover. But when people come to the UK, they're checked before they actually enter UK sovereign territory. So if they're inadmissible or if they're found to be trying to enter illegally, then they're stopped there and they don't make it as far as the UK. If they make it to the UK and lodge an asylum claim, then we are obliged to go through a lot of due process. And in that time, people can start to establish footholds. You can't just send people back.
So if someone is found in the back of a lorry, then they can claim asylum and then there's a process. They'll go to detention camp, presumably.
Well, I mean, yes, that's what will happen when we respond to, like immigration enforcement will respond to a lorry drop. Then, you know, the first thing is to interview the individuals to find out what, you know, how they got in. But if they then say, well, actually, I fear persecution, I want to claim asylum, then the UK will have to consider that asylum application, at least a first consideration. Now, normally that case should be remitted back to the first point of entry into the EU, which normally will be Greece or Italy, but it's not always clear that they've claimed asylum in Italy or Greece. And then as time goes by, eventually, you know, it builds up asylum applications in the UK, and that's what we've suffered from before. And we've had significant criticisms over many, many years from the Home Affairs Select Committee for not dealing with backlogs, but that's how those backlogs begin in the first place.
I mean, as someone who's worked in the services trying to deal with this matter, looking at the global situation in Europe and the Middle East, do you think there's anything really that can be done about people making these journeys?
Well, I mean, I think the latest initiative is to try to engage where we can with the source countries, and that is extremely difficult. We were down in Turkey recently at a conference. There's 2 million Syrian refugees just in Turkey alone. They're not going to stay in Turkey. But essentially, Turkey is a relatively safe place, and I think what we're looking to do is to find safe places in North Africa and East Africa where people can be returned to discourage these perilous journeys and fuel the smuggling gangs and, try and stop the situation at source.
Mr. Smith, thank you very much.